dear professors, speakers, attendees, and friends. We've seen a large spectrum of themes discussed in the past 2 days, providing us with a range of answers and many more questions on issues facing the transatlantic relationship today. I would like to thank all of the speakers and panelists and participants so far for taking part in the numerous panels, breakout sessions, and events of the conference. For the closing keynotes, the format will change a little bit and include a question and answer session after Professor Monti's remarks. It is a great pleasure to welcome our closing keynote speaker. Mario Monti is president of Bocconi University. Since February 2014, he has been chairman of the high-level group on own resources of the European Union. He was Prime Minister of Italy from November 2011 to April 2013, and Minister of Economy and Finance from November 2011 to July 2012. In November 2011, he was appointed Senator for Life by the President of the Italian Republic, Giorgio Napolitano. Since May 2014, he has been a member of the Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques. Also, since December 2015, he has been chairman of the first advisory group to Transparency International EU. He is a member of the Council on the Future of Europe of the Berggruen Institute, honorary president of Bruegel, the European think tank he founded in 2005, and a member of the Board of Trustees of Friends of Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Mario Monti.
Thank you very much for those nice introductory words. I do wish to congratulate very warmly the Columbia European Society. This is a very valuable initiative of undergraduate and graduate students, born, I understand, in the spring of 2015. So happy first anniversary. It's not for anyone at the age of 1 to set up such an ambitious Transatlantic Conference. This and the success this conference is having do augur well for the future of the Columbia European Society. And I hope also for the future of the underlying stock, Europe. When historians will look back at the state of the European Union in 2015, specifically in the spring, their attention will be caught by a number of very problematic developments. The Greek crisis. Of course, one can say, but that's been there for years, and who knows for the future. You know, but spring 2015 was a very special moment, economically, financially, and politically, of the Greek crisis. Mounting problems of refugees and migrants, growing mistrust among member states, as well as as between large segments of Europe's citizens and the EU institutions. But before passing a concluding totally negative judgment on that year, at least a body of particularly well-researched historians will point to a small but shining spot of light. Okay, not exactly located in the European Union, but somewhat west of it in New York, at Columbia. And that was the European Society at Columbia University. And I must say that as we become clearer to future historians, but even we contemporary observers can say that to have given birth to a European society, of all things, or to a European society at that moment, will deserve special mention and is a proof of bold and daring attitude. And therefore I'm really pleased to be part of your ambitious project with the Transatlantic Conference, and I hope to give some modest contribution. Don't expect the academic in me to give you significant glimpses of light. Maybe the practitioner which that academic has become due to the forces of life perhaps will help you a bit to reflect on the state, the development, the future, but also the past of the European Union. And I do hope that we do have some time at the end, which will depend partly on me, for questions and answers. I will try to present to you some remarks on basically 3 points. One, the overall policy framework of the European Union in the area of economic policies, which is a nice combination of considerations about the institutional architecture and also the policy content brought into that institutional architecture. In doing so, I will be guided to some extent by remarks made by Professor Stiglitz with his great authority yesterday. I could not be here, but of course the thinking of Professor Stiglitz is not entirely unknown to any of us. And I had an extremely skillful debriefing about what he said here yesterday, which will allow me to interact a bit with him, as I was fortunate enough to do on several occasions, particularly when he visited Rome when I was Prime Minister. Not at a very easy time, but of course there is no difficult enough time that should prevent a Prime Minister to pause for a few hours to discuss with a man of the strength, personality, charisma of Professor Stiglitz. In the second part of my remarks, I will say a few things on what, in my view, needs to be changed in that policy framework of the EU. And then finally, in the third part, I will turn from economic policy to broader, deeper, more worrying, existential questions about the crisis of the European Union and of European integration, and maybe of integration at large now. And I will venture to leave economics because I think the main determinants of these worrying developments are not mainly economic. One point that I understand that Professor Stiglitz developed was the question that he put to himself whether the lack of political union makes the EU insignificant on the global map of policies. This is a very pertinent question. My own answer to this is that it all depends. The European Union is, I believe, very significant in some policy areas, even though it's still far from embodying a political union, whereas it is tenuously relevant or next to irrelevant in other areas. I would say if I were to theorize, because after all we are in a key academic institution here, probably the relevance of policies formulated and enacted by the European Union globally is a function of two variables. One is essentially political, so the degree to which there is or there is not political union in Europe. The other one is more institutional and legal. That is, what attribution of powers did the member states of the European Union as far as that particular policy area is concerned? What did they attribute in terms of powers to the European Commission? I think that we need to inspect three areas essentially and to distinguish them from the rest of policy areas. The three areas are characterized by a fairly or by an extremely high degree of conferral of powers from the member states to the European Union level. And in those cases, the EU tends to be very impactful globally. These three areas must be distinguished by vintage. Two such areas came very early on, in fact, with the Rome Treaty, which in 1957 set up the European Economic Community, then to become the European Union. The third area is much more recent, but still almost venerable already in terms of age, because it was created in 1992 with the Treaty of Maastricht. You will have guessed that the first two areas to be born united in 1957 were trade and competition. And the third one, younger but very promising, is money. What do trade policy and competition policy have in common relative to many other policy areas such as social policies, environmental policies, foreign policies? Well, both areas, trade and competition, have been, by competition I mean antitrust policy, both were delegated since the very beginning by the European Union, by member states, by the signing parties to the treaty, to the European Union level, and vested into the European Commission as the executive body of the EU. Trade and competition, both of them since 1957, to become operational on January 1st, 1958. Yet there is more than a nuance of difference, because in the case of trade, now I'm simplifying a bit, many of you are trade experts, in the case of trade, the voice and the action of the Commission is key in the international trade negotiations to which the EU is a party, but still member states reserve the power for themselves to bless the course of action of the Commission at certain moments. And not only the member states, but later with the mounting powers of the European Parliament, also the European Parliament. So now for a trade negotiation like the TTIP, of which you discussed today, you do have the unitary and primary engine, which is the European Commission in the person of the Trade Commissioner. But then that is surrounded by the will of member states and the will of the European Parliament when it comes to the adoption or not of a trade agreement. Yet the will of the states there is less fully fledged flowing than it is in most other policy areas where the powers of the center of the Commission are more limited than in the trade case. So we can say that in the case of trade, the Commission has a quasi-supranational power. In the case of competition, which I had an opportunity, as some of you will know, of watching, indeed acting from within for 5 of my 10 years at the Commission, the other ones being as Commissioner for the Internal Market and Financial Services. 5 years were spent being Commissioner for Competition. There we reach the highest point of concentration of powers in the European Commission. Well, first of all, the definition of competition policy in the European setup is broader than it is in the setup of any other competition jurisdiction in the world. Why? Because the EU, being the only supranational entity to administer competition policy, it does deal through the European Commission with the behavior of companies, but also with the behavior of states themselves. The behavior of companies as regards illicit agreements of collusion among them, typically cartels, the abuse of dominant positions by dominant companies in a given market, which we call abuse of dominant position in Europe, which is called monopolization in the United States. And then thirdly, the need for companies, when they conceive structural operations such as mergers and acquisitions of above a certain threshold, of notifying them in advance to the competition authorities in order for them to be vetted and authorized or not authorized. These are therefore powers vested into a public power. In the US, there are 2 such public powers at the federal level: the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission. In most countries in the world, there is one national power, the National Competition Authority. In the European Union, there is one supranational power, the European Commission, also as antitrust agency. Except that in all other jurisdictions, except for the European Union, the oversight, the enforcement activity, which is conducted through the use of very robust powers, including the power to proposal putting somebody in jail or prohibiting a certain transactions or paying huge fines. In the case of the EU, there is the additional, very sensitive but very important function that the European Commission has an oversight also on state aid to companies. grants, funds granted by member states of the EU to companies. Financial assistance in one way or another. The rationale being very clear. It was very clear to Jean Monnet and the other founders of our recently all too criticized European Union, and including the fact that it would be a bit too much responsive to an ideology of neoliberalism. I wouldn't say this at all. It was very clear already in the Treaty of Rome that for having markets to perform an effective and efficient allocation of resources to stimulate growth in post-war Europe, we needed to have a single market, hence the removal of obstacles of all sorts, from tariffs to quotas to too much divergences in regulation. But it would have served a very small purpose to have a single market unrestricted by these restrictions, but yet where governments would have had free hand in subsidizing this or that company. Normally, of course, helping domestic companies to the detriment of fair competition in the single market. So it came as a necessary complementarity to act very liberally, but again through the use of public powers to dismantle restrictions, and to act very forcefully through public powers, competition agencies embodied in the European Commission, to prevent not only behavior by companies interfering with the functioning of markets, but also behavior by governments themselves, which is a very tough proposition also to administer in practice, because, okay, for the European Commission, like any antitrust agency, to be strong against monopolists or dominant companies or secret cartels perpetrators, you have to be strong, you have to resist the power of lobbies, okay, and you are a decent competition authorities if you do that. But in order to enforce state aid control, you need to police the behavior of somebody who, if we took the equivalent of a joint stock company, would be your shareholder. Because the European Commission is appointed by member states, then of course needs to have the confidence of the European Parliament. But member states are the shareholders of the European Union, and yet they agreed in the treaty to have themselves subjected to these competition policy enforcement powers. And unlike in trade, there is no voice left for member states once the Commission, at the proposal of the Competition Commissioner, has taken a decision, be it on state aids, i.e. with a public interlocutor, the government, be it on behavior or misbehavior, rather, of companies. Does this mean that the European Commission acts capriciously? Not really, because there is one European body, totally integrated, which is above the European Commission and which can review each and every decision of the European Commission, including a competition policy. That is the European Court of Justice, which, however, is a federal institution, again with members nominated by member states, but not directed by member states. So we see the strength of the powers there. And actually, relative, because I will then say a word on the transatlantic relationship in this area, relative to the US, the EU has the advantage in the area of competition that it has a more logical architecture. In the US you have two federal agencies, as I said, the FTC and the Antitrust Division at the Justice Department, without a very clearly defined division of competences between themselves. And on top of that, you have the role of 50 states attorney general. I saw when we both handled a Microsoft case in 2001 and 2 here, in 2004 in Europe. We, in the end, in 2004, came to a single decision valid throughout the European Union, decided by the European Commission. In the US, the previous settlement, which a couple of years earlier had intervened between the Justice Department and Microsoft, was not only different, too mild in our judgment, but also was not uncontested in the whole jurisdiction, because at the level of attorneys general of the states, who also had competence, there were disparate positions. So, I don't know which telephone number to call, said famously Henry Kissinger, at least in certain areas, the opposite might be true. Where does monetary policy step in then with the creation of the ECB? Well, it is again, like for the European Commission, like for competition, a federal institution, of course with members of the Governing Council of the Executive Committee appointed by governments and agreed by the European Parliament, but expressing a federal voice. And no one can say that in the area of competition and money, the EU does not matter. Some of you might remember cases, well, there is in terms of money a permanent dialogue between the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board and the president of the ECB, and there are less relevant counterparts elsewhere in the world. In terms of the more modest, macroeconomically speaking, but extremely impactful, microeconomically speaking, competition policy, there is a dialogue on certain methods between the various jurisdictions, but then there have been cases where the US has taken a decision on EU mergers or behavior because it had an impact on the US market or vice versa, and nobody in the corporate community in the US, the last exception having been Mr. Welch, the CEO of General Electric, when he underestimated a bit the role of the European jurisdiction and did not get approval of his takeover of Honeywell, which the Antitrust Department, Justice Department had already approved, but now each and every important operation is filtered through in advance by economists and lawyers, considering what will be the likely scrutiny of the competition authority. So, my very long answer to the question that I understand Professor Stiglitz will have asked himself about political union and the significance of the EU. In certain areas, the EU is definitely significant, even lacking political union. In other areas, particularly lacking political union, it's not very significant. And one of these areas is, of course, another area that you discussed in the course of this day, foreign and security policy. we shouldn't be surprised that it is so painful and so time-consuming and so difficult to come to united positions of the EU there. We are a bunch of former empires with different interests in the world over various centuries. And it's not an easy job to come to a convergence. Normally, convergences in the EU and steps forward in the EU have always been favored by the emergence of crisis. The EU has been built because of one fairly large crisis called World War II, without which it wouldn't have been remotely imaginable that countries like France and Germany would remove the periodic pleasure of going to war with each other and agree to some concessions of sovereignty. The setting up of the euro was the response to widespread and repeated crisis in the markets of foreign exchanges, and so on and so forth. And if we go back to the fundamental year in which the Columbia European Society was founded, in that year there was no lack of crisis surrounding the European Union from the point of view of foreign and security policy. From the Ukraine to Syria to Libya to tensions with Russia concerning a foreign economic policy issue like energy, and so on and so forth. So one might have been, on the basis of previous record, pretty optimistic that here are crises, in a short while will come the adequate response with a further upward movements in the sharing of sovereignty and therefore a more assertive common EU foreign and security policy. If this has not happened very much so far, I believe this is due to a very special nature of the current crisis in the EU, to which I will come as to the third and final point of my remarks in a moment, after I have dealt briefly with my second point, to which I turn now, that is the policy framework, the economic policy framework. Anybody who will have listened to Professor Stiglitz will probably not be very fond of the wisdom, effectiveness, intelligence of the EU economic policy framework. I discussed this with him, and so I take the liberty of discussing this with him even in his absence. And of course, if I misinterpret something that I understand he said, he and you will perhaps apologize, excuse me. Let us take a couple of defining points. Fiscal discipline / austerity, the mandate of the European Central Bank. I'm not totally sure that Professor Stiglitz removed these points. I'm sure that austerity, fiscal discipline, and the mandate of the ECB must have come out in his presentation. And on each of them, I'm sure he will have voiced his disconcert, which is also mine to some extent, but certainly not to his own extent. I think that American economists, especially at the top level, have a rather normal and fundamental difficulty in understanding that for the poor of us in Europe, doing economic policy is not an unconstrained exercise of maximization of some variables over the short term. It is something more complicated, perhaps because we are more complicated, perhaps because we like some degree of periodical, if not continuous, self-flagellation, but also simply because we aspire at becoming a European Union. As is the United States, I understand, did largely prior to the EU. Fiscal discipline, or even to make one step backward. Sometimes when I was Commissioner for Competition Policy, including therefore state aids control, governments and CEOs of major European companies would come to me and say, but how can you pretend that we compete with US companies, with growing Chinese and other BRICS companies? At the time, BRIC was very flourishing, more than today. If we in Europe have to operate with our hands tied by, among other people, you, because you put you have to have us observe constraints on the money that our governments can give to us. Well, the answer is, I'm sorry, but we have to do that, not so much because it is written in a treaty, but because if we want to build up a single market, and we aren't yet there yet, and you CEOs always tell us that you need a single market to have a strong domestic base for your international competitiveness. We have to discipline you as to the financing from governments. They say, but in the US there isn't such a thing. Yes, but in the US, after all, given the more unitary nature of the economic system, I know even the US is not a perfect single market, but it is much more closely single than we are in Europe. The US authorities don't have to bother too much if there is an aggressive policy of competition through incentives, tax facilitations, etc., as among the various states. That is part of the game, and after all, that is a unitary market with two things that we don't have in Europe. Number one, a very high labor mobility because of culture, because of singleness of the language, because of greater portability of pension and other rights. And secondly, there is a huge federal budget which can compensate the different economic cycles of various regions. We do not have such things in Europe, largely. Well, the singleness of languages, for good or for bad, is a more structural feature, because we aren't at the stage of political union so far. So please go back to your governments and tell them that if you have to be a bit paralyzed relative to your American-based competitors in terms of state aid controls, it's because they still are wanting to keep a lot of national sovereignty and haven't yet embraced political union. for politeness reason, I believe, they seemed partly convinced, but I'm not sure they were running then to their capitals and explained to the governments that it was their fault if we could not authorize more state aids. Equally for budgetary discipline and for all these apparently maniacal, I don't know what the word is, emphasis on limiting the deficits and the debts. Well, one difference is, of course, that although the euro has come up very well, much to the disbelief of American economists as a solid currency, it is not a reserve currency like the US dollar still is. So we face more inherent constraints to the exercise of our fiscal pleasures and leniencies. Secondly, if the US decides to respond to a major downturn in the economy, as it happened not many years ago, it does have the powerful instrument of issuing more public debt. Also because it is one public debt, the debt of the US Treasury on different durations, technical forms, but it is US federal debt. Replicate that in the EU, automatically you are charged with a distributional issue that you do not have in the US. The same distributional issue which postponed considerably the setting in motion, in the case of Europe, of quantitative easing by the ECB, especially when it came to the acquisition of government bonds by the ECB. There was not only the ideological opposition of German monetary thinking to the idea of monetizing a government debt through purchase by the ECB, but also the fact of which government bonds to buy. Indirectly, which government within the Union to facilitate a bit in running an extra deficit. So, to share one currency and not share many other aspects of the economic structures and of the political structures undoubtedly puts more restraints and restrictions on a system. Should one then conclude that it was premature or wrong to create the single currency? I do not believe so. I do not believe so, also because had we not had the euro in place when the Lehman Brothers incident happened, not in Frankfurt or London, if I remember well, all the consequent vagaries in the foreign exchange, in the financial markets, would have brought to huge non-coherent fluctuations in the relative value of our currencies. The Deutsche Mark relative to the lira and to the Spanish currency, that would have created so great tensions that it would hardly have been possible to stick to a single market unimpeded by either compensatory state aids or other financial tricks to try and re-establish the competitive playing field. Do I then believe, because I believe that we are inherently bound to have to pay for some time greater attention to the deficits and the debts i.e. to the weaponry of fiscal discipline, does that mean that the way in which German orthodoxy interprets that is entirely acceptable to me? No, it does not. If I may lighten this by now longish presentation with a little anecdote. When I was Prime Minister of Italy and I was due to visit President Obama in the White House, the US ambassador to Rome came to see me and wanted to indicate to me very kindly in advance that the President would have wished in the beginning of our conversation to deal at some length with a rather uncommon topic from those conversations. That is, he wanted to know how I was dealing with Chancellor Merkel on economic policy issues. Because he had been told that I had a fairly constructive dialogue with her, although moving from two quite different national backgrounds. So I was a bit prepared and made it rather short and said, sorry to say this, but neglect all the very thorough advice given to you by your economic advisors in terms of stimulating demand to foster more growth. By the way, this was at the beginning of an electoral year, 2012, so the President was extremely interested in, for general interest, to avoid a Eurozone crisis and to have a more solid European growth. But on top of that, he was concerned in the first place that Italy should not fall down with the financial crisis. Otherwise, that would have created a huge fire in the whole of the Eurozone with consequences on the global economy in an electoral year. So he was very interested in what I could do or not do in the Italian context. And so he had an interest in promoting more generation of growth by Germany. So I said, sorry, but do not take that advice very much into consideration. And just remember that for Germans, including Mrs. Merkel, but for Germans in general, including many social democrats, economics is still a branch of moral philosophy. And economic growth is the reward to good ethical behavior by the household, the company, the state. So everything which may intrigue you and me and others intellectually because it comes through the multiplier, the accelerator, the expansion of demand, including government current expenditure deficit, is not going to fly. Let us try, you and I, you and we in Europe, to find a rather narrow but non-negligible window of opportunity where your vision of the economy, Anglo-Saxon, and Merkel's and the Germans' vision of the economy may combine. We need to look for one component of aggregate demand which has to you the advantage, to Merkel the disadvantage of stimulating growth, but which has at least the advantage to you and to Merkel at the same time, that on top of being a component of demand, It also is virtuous because it widens the productive capacity and therefore is a prerequisite for supply in the future. So you can present that as a supply side policy with effects on demand. That is public sector investment. A topic which in the meantime has become even more important in debates over here as well as in the European Union. And there, some progress has been achieved, also because of the very lively conversations held in the margins of some G8 and G20 meetings between the President of the US and the European leaders. But much still remains to be done. And here we need, this is my conviction now, apart from the US administration, we need to show to the Germans that even those who, like me, stick after all to their moral vision of economic processes, because we have seen in continental and southern Europe too many episodes of lightly, superficially motivated demand expansions through deficits, practiced in fact in order to gain votes to the detriment of future generations. So rather to this immoral but economically sophisticated view, I tend to prefer the moral, although slightly naive German view. Which is the difference when you put on top of your formation as an academic economist your direct experience with politicians, with parliaments and governments. So now I think that even taking for granted the moral structure of the German reasoning, they are wrong, not right, when they insist that public investment might be a good thing, unlike current expenditure deficit. But if it is done through government borrowing, so through indebtedness, then this is not to be encouraged. This is to be repressed, be it in Germany or in other countries. You probably know that German is the only language in which debt and guilt coincide. And this tells a lot about the philosophy, the religion, the moral structure of a country's psychology. But I think on this it is very important and urgent to change the rules, including in the Stability Pact. And it is interesting to debate, for example, with the most lucid economic mind in German policy-making, Chancellor Schäuble, Finance Minister Schäuble, that he wants, like I want, the Stability and Growth Pact to protect future generations from the excesses of current politicians. But when interest rates are very low or zero, especially for German, and he refrains to borrow a bit more as federal government, supposedly to protect future generations of Germans, he does the disadvantage of future generations of Germans because he prevents them from inheriting a higher stock of productive public capital, which would generate a stream of income and production considerably higher over the years than the rate of interest locked in for many years at these low levels to service the debt. Finally, on the framework of policies, I know that Professor Stiglitz, like many others, would like to change the mandate of the European Central Bank because it is too restrictive, because unlike the Fed's mandate, does not make room for the sustainment of growth by the ECB. I beg to disagree. Why? Again, for political economy reasons, not for abstract theoretical reasoning. And basically for two very concrete reasons. Number one, we have seen in the episode of 2012, I know that there are in this room some highly sophisticated scholars of financial history who are working on this. We have seen in those cases that it is possible, simply by arranging some agreements in the political sphere of Europe, to let the ECB feel freer in its own independence, to pursue more vigorously stabilization and even growth, without a need to change their mandate. And the second reason is more a reason of worry, knowing the political world. The day that you change through a treaty the mandate and you entrust the ECB also with the duty to take care of growth, not just price stability, I bet that the following day the politicians of Europe at the national level as well as at the EU level would, in face of a dissatisfactory growth, finger point Frankfurt and the ECB. They have great powers, they are not constrained, they can print money, growth is unsatisfactory, why don't they do more? And this would further reduce the incentives on politicians to do more incisively the politically costly for them, but economically virtuous policies of structural reforms, etc., etc. So this is why I would not favor something that, from an American perspective, would seem to be an obvious change. Final, third and very quick point, because I have really spoken too much at length, but you are too attentive and diligent. You have not vigorously enough conveyed your signs on the impatience. Why do I believe that this crisis for the EU is a bit less conducive to regenerating forward steps in European integration? Because I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that this is not a crisis of European integration. I believe that we are witnessing a crisis, a much broader crisis of integration. We have, in all our national political systems, with the exception so far of the system of China and a few other countries, a dramatic shortening of the time horizon of everything. Short-termism characterizes the horizon over which economic and non-economic policy decisions are made. And it also characterizes the style and the framework of the political discourse and electoral debates. And this gives a greater and greater competitive advantage to those who can capture the sympathy of audiences and of people already angry, rightly so, for the lack of employment and many other things which are real problems. They can be easily captured by personalities, movements, who give the impression of having shortcut solutions which leverage on anger and adversarialship, adversarial positions. It takes less than 10 seconds, even for a slow speaker like me, to say, our country is losing out in competitiveness. We lack employment. Let's close our borders to foreign products. Very seductive. To say, yes, apparently that's not a bad idea. But if you look into economic history, if you look at the various experiences, if you consider the indirect long-term effects, that is normally a recipe for failure. And to be convincing on this, it will take you at least 1 or 2 minutes. So integration is the most difficult, the most abstract, the most important to me for economic and political coexistence of countries in a peaceful environment. The most difficult concept, and it is going to be coming out of debates at an increasingly Ricardian competitive disadvantage. So integration is the victim of the, in my view, degeneration of current political systems in our countries. This brings to disintegration or tendencies to disintegration within countries. There are also other cultural reasons, but look at Catalonia, look at Scotland, etc., etc. To disintegration globally, look at the backward movements for a few years already in terms of the WTO achievements. And disintegration in between the national and the global level, which is regional integration, and the EU in particular. So integration suffered because of the evolution of policies, politics. Integration was admittedly in Europe the product of elites. Suppose that the most important act of European integration, the Schuman Declaration of 1950, urging France, Germany and the others to put together coal and steel to avoid being even able to have a new war. Suppose that, as we would demand today, that should go through a referendum, the minimum of decent democracy, 5 years after the end of the war, and almost of the war, well, 95% would have voted against it. And the EU wouldn't even have started. So, I think that we will not be able to rescue, really, European integration and its forward dynamic. And the consequences of this may be very serious, because it's not that countries in continental Europe, or Europe in general, have a tendency to be at peace. The contrary is true. And without integration, war is likely. With the current political systems, integration is at risk. Integration in Europe, at least, was the result of high politics in the decades after the war. I think this integration now in Europe and more generally is the likely outcome of very, very, very low-key politics. I believe not only prevailing only in Europe, for which we, public opinion, are, I believe, a bit guilty. Because we, for example, consider it as not even a minor sin, as no sin at all, that politicians in power want to use the instruments of policies in order to be re-elected. We take it as normal that a British Prime Minister alters the life of Europe for 3 years in order to put to fruition an idea that would secure to him the continuation of his control over his party. We find it normal that 5 presidents of European institutions put out last year, the year famously known because the Columbia European Society, the report of the 5 presidents, which says, incidentally, that some reforms in the governance of Europe are badly needed and urgent, but that they should not be tackled before 2017. And everybody knows that that gap in time is due to the fact that in 2017 there are elections in Germany and France. We all take this not as an unbearable caprice of people in power, but we bear this as normal price to be paid to our democracies, except that in so many respects, and the life of the European Union over the last couple of years will provide ample concrete cases of illustration. Through this, we are dismantling European integration. I'm not so concerned of disintegration through separation. I'm still convinced that Brexit and even Brexit ultimately will not occur, but it is a risk of disintegration from within, with the predominance of lower and lower quality of politics supplied within the member states, which shamefully fills the space, the political space for Europe, that is the European Council, with a cacophony of 28, let's not call them national interests. It would be bad enough if they were 28 national interests instead of one forward-looking European interest. But they are presented politically as national interests, but they cover normally electoral interests of the personality of the parties in power in that very moment. So I do not believe that we can revamp European integration if we do not revamp also our national democracies. So, and as you can see, it's quite a tall order. Thank you very much for your incredible attention.
Thank you so very much to Mr. Monti for such an insightful closing keynote address. Would you like to take questions?
To the extent that my residual voice in the audience's residual patience allow us with pleasure limited in time.
Okay. Do we have any? Yes.
Hello, Mr. Monti. Thank you for being here. So my question is, you spoke about the necessity of integration, how that is relevant for the future of Europe. And I just wanted to know, there have been...
Sorry, where are you?
Right here.
See, I hate short-termism also physically. Sorry, could you start again?
So you mentioned the importance of having integration in Europe for the future of Europe, and also I applied that to the future of the world. But I just wanted to know, there is a conflict occurring in Europe right now with you also alluded to the fact that there have been questions of democracy, like the rise of liberal democracy in Hungary, Poland, and different parties. And I just wanted to know, to what extent is it important for institutional reform to take those into account first? And second, to what extent is there a necessity for a grander European identity to overcome those challenges to democracy and include democracy as a common ground for Europeans to move forward?
Yes, there have been challenges to democracy. To what extent is the EU system and architecture resilient to these challenges? There is one point of no return which hasn't been applied yet. I think it is Article 7 of the treaty, which does require conformity with certain key standards of democracy and democratic behavior in order to be and continue to be a member of the EU. This has a parallel in the famous Copenhagen criteria, which were to and did preside over the accession policy of member states. Certainly what is happening in Hungary in particular, more recently Poland, interrogates us most vividly. Also because there was the belief, I for example never had a doubt on this, that one key component of the strong wish of those countries to join the European Union was to permanently and structurally link in their system to a democratic order. And we did everything in the preparation phase in order to take into account one of their concerns, namely, many of them were saying we desperately are keen to join the EU, but we don't want to have left Moscow to join Brussels as a new Moscow. And we took that into consideration in many policies. For example, this is a small detail, but I was working on this, and this was a consideration for me. In 2004, precisely to go into effect on the day of the big enlargement, as far as competition policy was concerned, we put in place a huge reform which, whilst ensuring the coherence of competition policy, nevertheless hugely enhanced the delegations of powers to the national competition authorities in each capital. Because I was aware that with competition policies come frequently rather unpleasant news to a country. For example, hey government, you cannot go on subsidizing that company, which may create temporary unemployment problems. So we wanted to have the local culture and the local policy making to share the ownership of these policies, of the sweet but also of the bitter policies. Now, and this was reflected in many, many other policies. And all of a sudden it seems to be the case that in some of these countries the nostalgia for a strong public power, however connotated, seems to prevail over continuous adherence to newly found democratic values. And I am really puzzled when I hear some people from Poland, for example, rewriting the retrospective of all what was done to support their country in the accession process, including financially. And then we do have to ask ourselves what has gone wrong in the way of presenting the European Union, not only to our old constituencies in the original member states, but also to the new member states, because at the same time, the fact of having brought in rather quickly by historical standards those countries has generated a lot of anxiety and discontent in our Western member states. The syndrome in France and the Netherlands of the Polish plumber in 2005. So I believe that you did the only thing that historically was to be done, that is reunite Europe without waiting too long. I'm not sure that given the tonality then taken up by Mr. Putin in Russia, had we waited for a much more gradualistic approach, and had we still have today, if we still had today the whole area between Slovenia and Estonia in the grey status of candidate country, I would fear for them and for us. So I don't think it was done the wrong thing, but obviously something played out unexpectedly.
Professor, what is necessary and how long do you think it will take to establish a fiscal union within the Eurozone?
It's not always easy to define what we mean by fiscal union. I think it means three things. One is a further refinement in the enforcement of standards and constraints on national budgets. A second component has to do with the taxation systems. Not everybody does include this in the notion of fiscal union, but to me this is very relevant. And the third element is what about the EU budget? And let me just say, how long it will take. Some things are indeed happening and rather quickly. Others will be lengthy because they are areas in which the unanimity vote reigns. This is particularly the case for tax coordination or tax harmonization and for the budget of the EU issue. Let me say just a word there because I didn't refer to it at all. One of the changes needed for the life of the EU and for the economic policy framework of the EU is indeed the federal finances in Europe. And I happen to be in charge of a group set up by the European Parliament, Council and the Commission, which has to make proposals by the end of this year on a new way of financing the EU budget. There you have the issue of the size of the budget, which theoretically we should not address, and the issue of the modality of financing. But the issue of the size is putting a lot of questions concerning in particular the ability or not of the EU to perform a macroeconomic stabilization function as Richard Musgrave would have characterized it, and as is exercised by all budgets of governments. And there is a problem of composition of the expenditure, with a lot of expenditure still devoted to policies that were geared on the past of the European Union, so many subsidies to agriculture or to regional policies, so relatively little support to research and other things. And also the modalities of financing, which today, unlike in the early days of the EU, are for 85%, I would say, purely national contributions from member states, with a system of rebates and counter rebates that make the whole thing hardly intelligible, not progressive but regressive and totally undemocratic. We will make proposals to change this. Now I want to exploit this current phase in which, for the first time in many years, member states with the refugee crisis, the migration issues, the terrorism/intelligence issues, and the protection of external border issues are coming up with demands for new functions to be exercised by Brussels, by the EU, and no longer only with demands for devolution back home. I hope I'm able to find compelling arguments to say that if member states themselves, for the first time in many years, come up with designated new own functions for the European Union, then it would only be logical to come up also with new own resources. But to give you an idea, we will present this report. If the European Commission likes it, it may take it up totally or partly in the legislative proposals it will make for the future. That will have to go through unanimous approval by member states in the Council and the majority vote in the European Parliament. And if all that goes well, it will then require ratification in each of the 28 member states.
Unfortunately, we are out of time.
Sorry?
Unfortunately, we are out of time.
And voice. But not of interest for Europe. Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here and thanking Mr. Monti once more for joining us today and for sharing his insight with us. It has been such an honor. And thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today, and thank you to all our participants for helping us make this project a reality. Today, this conference has been an entire year in the making, from the time the Columbia European Society first conceived of the idea exactly 1 year ago this April. The team has worked tirelessly towards this goal. This conference is really inextricably bound together with the mission of CES. From the very start, our student group was founded in order to address the lack of transatlantic dialogue and to do our part as students and as global citizens to bring attention back to a vital region of the world. And to achieve this, there is no better way, we thought, than a conference of this type, a forum in which experts and students, the leaders of both today and tomorrow, could engage in debate on the most vital and pressing questions of the transatlantic relationship. And this has been an incredibly enriching experience. We have heard from the world's foremost experts in transatlantic relations, from academia, business, and policymaking. And we as students have had the opportunity to learn, discuss, and ask the questions about the US-European partnership that matters so much to us. There has been much disagreement as well as agreement. It has been an opportunity for direct and frank exchange of ideas, a time in which we have not hesitated to engage in the type of transatlantic friendship Professor Stiglitz mentioned in his opening keynote, a friendship that is strong enough and steadfast enough to both allow and benefit greatly from open and constructive criticism. And as the president and the co-founder of the Columbia European Society and co-chair of the Transatlantic Conference, I would like to express my gratitude to all our speakers for their invaluable contributions to the stimulating debate and discussion we have had. I am grateful to you, our attendees, for your support and for taking part in these debates and discussions with us. And I would like to extend our thanks to all our sponsors, the Columbia European Institute, the European Union's Getting to Know Europe program, the Boston Consulting Group Germany, the Harriman Institute at Columbia, the German Consulate General in New York City, the Center for American Studies at Columbia, and the Columbia University Joint Council co-sponsorship. We would also like to thank our partners and friends, Deutsches Haus here at Columbia, where we had lunch today, the Columbia Society of International Law, the Columbia Business School European Society, Professor Volker Berghan, our academic advisor, Professor Mark Anderson, Magdalena Pirer, Isabel Ferreira, Christoph Kramer, Lily Moss, Daniela dos Santos Quaresma, Johannes Ruby, and Natalie Sykes. To everyone who has supported us and believed in this project, grazie, Tesecula, Kiitos, mulțumesc, gracias, merci, danke, and thank you. And finally, I would like to thank the absolutely incredible organizing team of the Transatlantic Conference at Columbia 2016, without whom this conference would never have been possible. Juja Mamri, Vice President of the Columbia European Society. Jansu Navachoglu, Treasurer. Anton Sander, Think Tank Coordinator. And our sponsorship team, Alexis Buddy, AJ Marcus, and Lucas Schwendler. The PR and communications team, Ekin Orhu, Matthew Zip, Jane Luca, and webmaster Ken Aizawa. The speakers team, Lucas Salomon, Asa Baladi, Marcel Book. And the logistics team, Jamie Whithorn, Elise Fabianula, Morgan Williams, Alexandra Montesh, Karsten Ball, and Benedicta Solf. And last but not least, I would like to thank my conference co-chair, head of sponsorship, and vice president of external operations, Stanislas Ponce. Dedication, his commitment, energy, and sheer joy in this project have never wavered. He is the best co-chair I could ever have imagined, the best vice president of external operations, the best head of sponsorship, and a very dear friend. And it has been a delight to work with him and with this entire team.
I must say a few words as well. After months of working with my co-chair, Catherine, I believe I speak not only for myself, but in the name of the entire organizing team, and extending my sincere gratitude and admiration for your inexhaustible efforts towards the completion of this conference. So please join me in thanking Catherine as well.
Thank you, and I believe that...
Thank you all so much for your hard work.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, and see you at the Transatlantic Conference
Next year.
Thank you.